The observation deck of the Meridian's edge stretched across the ship's dorsal section like a metallic horizon, its transparent aluminum viewports offering an unobstructed view of the void. Commander Zethkar stood motionless, his forearms clasped behind his chitinous back, watching the human training below with the detached fascination of a xenobiologist studying a particularly volatile specimen. The human's name was Markuschan, though the Zilithian commander had taken to thinking of him simply as the anomaly. In the 6 months since the Terran integration protocol had begun, Zethkar had overseen the training of 47 different species. None had proven as unpredictable as the humans. Subject exhibits standard parameters, his aide, Subcommander Vrax, reported through the neural link, his mental voice carrying the sterile precision typical of their species. Heart rate, elevated but within acceptable ranges. Stress hormones, marginally increased. Aggression indicators, minimal. Zethkar's mandibles clicked in what passed for contemplation among his people. The readings were indeed standard, but something about the human's posture suggested otherwise. Marcus moved through the combat simulation with fluid efficiency, his weapon tracking targets with mechanical precision, but there was a tension in his shoulders, a tightness around his eyes that the sensors couldn't quantify. The Zilithians had been monitoring human physiology for months now, ever since the Treaty of Vega had established the first joint military alliance between their species. What they'd discovered had been troubling. Humans, it seemed, operated under a complex system of biological and psychological limiters, safety mechanisms that prevented them from accessing their full potential. Most of the time. Increase simulation difficulty to level 7, Zethkar ordered, his mental voice cutting through the observation deck silence. Below, the holographic battlefield shifted. The previous scenario, a simple tactical engagement against drone targets, dissolved into something far more complex. Urban warfare, civilian casualties, impossible odds. Marcus adapted without hesitation, but Zethkar noticed the micro-expressions that crossed his face. The brief flicker of concern when a holographic child appeared in his line of fire. The split-second hesitation before engaging targets near a simulated hospital. These weren't weaknesses the commander had learned, but rather evidence of the sophisticated moral framework that seemed to govern human behavior. It was also evidence of the restraints. Sir, Vrax's mental voice carried note of uncertainty. The human stress indicators are approaching the threshold we established for training cessation. Zethkar's compound eyes never left the figure below. Marcus was breathing harder now, sweat beading on his forehead as he navigated an increasingly impossible scenario. The simulation had been designed to push subjects to their breaking point, to identify the limits of their capabilities. For most species, those limits were clearly defined: exhaustion, fear, or simple tactical overload. Humans were different. Continue, Zethkar ordered. The battlefield below erupted into chaos. Enemy combatants materialized from every conceivable hiding spot, their weapons tracking the lone human figure with predatory precision. Marcus moved like water, his body seeming to flow between cover positions, but the commander could see the telltale signs of approaching failure. The slight tremor in his hands, the way his breathing had shifted from controlled to ragged. Sir, his stress hormones have spiked beyond safe parameters, Vrax reported, his mental tone carrying genuine concern now. The human claims a species is ready for full integration into our military structure, Zethkar interrupted, his thoughts cutting through his aide's protests. If they cannot handle our standard training protocols, perhaps they are not as formidable as they believe. It wasn't entirely true. The humans had already proven themselves in several smaller conflicts, their unconventional tactics and apparent fearlessness earning grudging respect from even the most xenophobic members of the Galactic Defense Council. But there were questions. Disturbing reports from human military advisors about certain psychological phenomena that their species preferred not to discuss. Something about going dark or losing the thread. References to historical incidents where human soldiers had exhibited behavior that seemed to contradict everything known about their psychology. The humans themselves seemed genuinely frightened by these accounts, which only made them more intriguing to a species like the Zilithians, who had long ago eliminated such unpredictable variables from their own nature. Below, Marcus stumbled behind a concrete barrier, his weapon clattering across the simulated rubble. His chest rose and fell in sharp, desperate breaths, and for a moment, Zethkar thought he might collapse. Instead, the human did something unexpected. He laughed. It wasn't the controlled chuckle of someone finding humor in a difficult situation. This was something else entirely, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep and primal, carrying notes that made the commander's exoskeleton prickle with unease. "Increase to level 8, Zethkar ordered. "Sir, that's beyond the established safety parameters for any species," Vrax protested. "The simulation at that level is designed to kill." Zethkar's mental voice carried dark amusement. "The human will either adapt or fail. Either outcome provides valuable data." The holographic environment around Marcus shifted again, becoming something that barely qualified as a battlefield. This was a slaughter scenario, the kind used to test artificial intelligences and combat robots. The odds weren't just impossible, they were mathematically absurd. That's when Zethkar saw it happen. Marcus Chen's eyes changed. The transformation was subtle at first, just a shift in focus, a 1,000-yard stare that seemed to look through rather than at the approaching enemies. But there was something else, something that the sensors couldn't measure, but that sent an instinctive chill through every Zilithian on the observation deck. The safety was coming off. Marcus rose from behind his cover with fluid grace, but his movements had changed. Gone was the careful, controlled precision he'd demonstrated before. In its place was something that seemed almost predatory. He moved through the battlefield like a force of nature, his weapon an extension of his will rather than a tool in his hands. "What are his stress indicators showing?" Zethkar asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "That's impossible," Vrax stammered, his mental voice filled with confusion. "His heart rate is actually decreasing. Stress hormones are leveling out. It's as if he's entered some kind of meditative state, but his performance has increased exponentially." Below them, Marcus was no longer fighting the simulation. He was dismantling it. Each movement was economical, brutal, and utterly without hesitation. He dispatched holographic enemies with the same casual efficiency one might use to swat insects, his face a mask of terrifying calm. But it was his eyes that truly disturbed the Zilithian commander. They had gone completely flat, empty of everything that had made him recognizably human just moments before. There was no fear, no anger, no emotion at all. Just a cold, calculating intelligence that seemed to evaluate everything around him in terms of threats to be eliminated. "Sir," Vrax's mental voice was barely a whisper. "I'm reading some kind of neurochemical cascade in his brain. Endorphins, adrenaline, but also something else. Something we don't have classification for." Zethkar watched in fascination as Marcus moved through the impossible scenario with supernatural efficiency. This wasn't the trained soldier they'd been observing for months. This was something else entirely, something primal and ancient that had been hiding beneath the surface of human civility. The simulation ended not because Marcus had failed, but because he'd eliminated every single target with such ruthless efficiency that the system had nothing left to throw at him. He stood in the center of the holographic battlefield, surrounded by the dissolving remnants of his enemies, breathing slowly and steadily, as if he'd just completed a casual stroll. Then, like a switch being flipped, he collapsed. The transformation was as sudden as it had been dramatic. One moment he was a figure of terrifying competence. The next he was on his knees, retching violently as his body shook with what appeared to be system shock. Medical team to Training Bay 7, Zethkar ordered, though his attention remained fixed on the figure below. And prepare a full neurological workup. As the medical personnel rushed to assist Marcus, Zethkar found himself contemplating what he'd just witnessed. The humans had been holding back, that much was clear. But what they'd been holding back wasn't just capability. It was something far more fundamental and far more dangerous. Sir, Vrax's mental voice carried a note of concern that transcended mere professional duty. Should we be concerned about the implications of this discovery? Zethkar watched as Marcus was helped to his feet, noting how the human seemed almost confused, as if he didn't quite remember what had just happened. There were precedents for this kind of dissociative state among various species, but they were typically associated with complete psychological breakdown, not enhanced performance. Schedule a meeting with the human military liaison, he ordered. It seems we need to have a conversation about the true nature of their species. As the observation deck emptied and the lights dimmed, Zethkar remained at his position by the viewport, his compound eyes reflecting the cold light of distant stars. He'd sought to understand the limits of human capability, but what he'd discovered instead was that humans might not have limits in the traditional sense. They had something far more dangerous, a switch that could be flipped, transforming them from reasoned beings into something that existed purely to eliminate threats. The implications were staggering, not just for their military alliance, but for the future of galactic civilization itself. What kind of species evolved a failsafe that turned them into perfect killers? And more importantly, what had driven them to develop such a mechanism in the first place? Dr. Sarah Chun, no relation to Marcus, though the coincidence of surnames had raised eyebrows among the Zolithian administrators, sat across from Commander Zethkar in what the humans had dubbed the diplomatic suite, though it bore little resemblance to anything terrestrial. The room was designed to accommodate multiple species, with adjustable gravity fields, atmospheric controls, and seating that could adapt to various anatomical requirements. Sarah had chosen to remain in standard human configuration, partly out of comfort and partly because she wanted the Zolithian commander to see her as she truly was. No accommodations, no diplomatic niceties, just a human being with a story to tell. Your subordinate performed remarkably well in yesterday's simulation, Zethkar began, his translated voice carrying the clinical detachment typical of his species. Though I confess, the nature of his performance has raised certain questions. Sarah studied the alien commander's face, noting the subtle tension in his mandibles that suggested anxiety despite his calm demeanor. She'd spent years learning to read Zolithian expressions, part of her preparation for this assignment. What she saw now was fear, carefully controlled but unmistakably present. "What kind of questions?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Your species appears to possess capabilities that were not disclosed during the initial treaty negotiations," Zethkar replied. "Capabilities that suggest significant military applications." Sarah sighed, a very human sound that seemed to puzzle the alien commander. She'd known this day would come eventually. The humans had been careful during the early phases of integration, selecting only personnel who demonstrated exceptional self-control and emotional stability. But Marcus Chun had always been a risk, not because he was unstable, quite the opposite. Marcus was one of the most psychologically balanced individuals she'd ever evaluated. But he was also a combat veteran, and combat veterans carried certain modifications to their neurological architecture that made them both valuable and dangerous. "Commander Zethkar," she began, choosing her words carefully, "how much do you know about human evolutionary history?" The alien's compound eyes shifted slightly, a sign of confusion. "Your species evolved from proto-simian ancestors approximately 6 million years ago, developing advanced cognitive capabilities through a process of natural selection that favored." "That's the academic version," Sarah interrupted gently. "Let me tell you the version we don't usually share with other species." She stood and walked to the room's viewport, gazing out at the stars as she gathered her thoughts. How do you explain to an alien species that your own people frightened you? How do you describe the thing that lived in the depths of human psychology, waiting for the right trigger to emerge? Humans are apex predators, Commander. We evolved not just to survive, but to dominate. Every aspect of our physiology and psychology reflects that evolutionary imperative. Our forward-facing eyes for tracking prey. Our opposable thumbs for creating tools. Our complex social structures for coordinating hunts. Zethkar's mandibles clicked in what she recognized as skepticism. Many species possess similar characteristics. This does not explain what we observed. You're right, Sarah agreed. But humans had one additional challenge during their evolutionary development. We weren't just hunting other species, we were competing with our own. For resources, territory, mates. The selection pressure was intense, and it drove us to develop capabilities that most species never required. She turned back to face the commander, noting how his posture had shifted slightly. He was listening, now really listening. We call it the berserker state, though the term has roots in ancient human warrior cultures. It's a neurological and psychological phenomenon that temporarily overrides our normal cognitive and emotional processing in favor of pure survival instinct. A form of temporary psychosis. Zethkar asked. No, Sarah said firmly. That's the mistake most people make when they first learn about it. It's not a breakdown of mental function. It's a different kind of mental function altogether. The brain doesn't stop working. It starts working differently. All the limitations we normally place on ourselves, moral, ethical, physical, get temporarily suspended in favor of a single directive. Eliminate the threat. She sat back down, leaning forward slightly to emphasize her next point. What you saw yesterday wasn't Marcus losing control. It was him accessing a level of control that most humans never experience. Complete, perfect, terrifying control focused on a single objective. Zethkar was quiet for a long moment, his alien features unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a new note of wariness. How common is this phenomenon among your species? Every human has the capacity for it, Sarah replied honestly. But most never access it. Modern human society is specifically designed to prevent the kind of extreme stress that triggers the state. We've built civilizations that protect us from situations where we might need to unleash ourselves. But soldiers are different. Combat exposure can sensitize the neural pathways that govern the response. The more combat someone has seen, the more easily they can access the state. Marcus has seen more combat than most. Sarah paused, considering how much she should reveal. The Zilithians were allies, but they were also potential threats. If they understood the true implications of what they'd witnessed. There's something else you should know, she continued. The berserker state isn't just about individual capability. It's contagious. Zethkar's entire body went rigid, his forearms pulling closer to his torso in what she recognized as a defensive posture. Explain. Humans are social creatures, Commander. When one member of a group enters the berserker state, it can trigger similar responses in others nearby. It's part of our pack hunting instincts. When one hunter engages maximum aggression, the others follow suit to ensure the kill. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Sarah could see the commander processing the information, calculating the potential consequences of integrating humans into larger military units. How do you control it? He asked finally. Training, discipline, careful psychological screening. Sarah's voice carried the weight of professional experience. We've developed extensive protocols for identifying individuals at risk and teaching them management techniques. But there's always the possibility of unexpected activation. And if it spreads through a military unit? Sarah met his gaze directly. Then you have what human military historians call a berserker company. a group of soldiers operating without normal psychological limitations, focused entirely on destroying anything they perceive as a threat. Has this occurred in actual combat situations? The question hung in the air like a blade. Sarah knew she was at a crossroads: tell the truth and potentially destroy the Humans-Alithian alliance, or lie and leave them unprepared for what they might face. She chose truth. Yes, multiple times throughout human history. The results were significant. Entire enemy armies routed by relatively small human forces. Battles that should have been impossible victories turned into complete massacres. It's part of the reason humans developed such extensive military traditions focused on discipline and control. Zethkar stood abruptly, pacing to the viewport with swift, agitated movements. And you brought personnel with these capabilities onto our ships without full disclosure? We brought our best people, Commander. Personnel who had demonstrated exceptional control and judgment under extreme circumstances. But yes, that includes combat veterans who have accessed the Berserker state in the past. How many? Sarah hesitated. Of the 47 humans currently serving in integrated units, 15 have confirmed Berserker incidents in their service records. Another 8 are classified as high probability based on psychological profiles. The alien commander turned to face her, his compound eyes reflecting light in a way that suggested intense agitation. Nearly half of your personnel are potential berserkers. Nearly half of our personnel are survivors, Commander. They're the ones who came back from conflicts that killed others. They're here because they represent the absolute best of human military capability. And the absolute most dangerous. Sarah nodded slowly. Yes. But that's why I'm here. My job is to monitor them, to identify stress indicators that might trigger an episode, and to implement containment protocols if necessary. What kind of containment protocols? Isolation, sedation if necessary, and psychological intervention to help them return to normal cognitive function. The Berserker state is temporary, Commander. It requires enormous energy expenditure and places massive stress on the human body. Most episodes last only a few minutes to a few hours at most. And if containment fails? Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully. Then you evacuate all personnel from the affected area and wait for the Berserker to either complete their objective or exhaust themselves. Attempting to physically restrain someone in that state typically results in significant casualties among the restraining force. Zethkar returned to his seat, his movements careful and controlled. Dr. Chun, I must ask directly, are we safe having humans aboard our vessels? That depends on your definition of safe, Sarah replied honestly. Under normal circumstances, absolutely. Human personnel are highly trained, disciplined, and committed to the success of this alliance. But if you create conditions that trigger a Berserker response, she let the implication hang in the air. What kind of conditions? Extreme physical or psychological stress. Situations where the individual perceives no alternative except maximum aggression. Threats to fellow humans, especially those they consider under their protection. And sometimes, she paused, sometimes it can be triggered by what the individual perceives as betrayal or deliberate cruelty. The room fell silent again, both species representatives lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Zethkar spoke. Yesterday's training scenario may have been overly aggressive. Yes, Sarah agreed. Marcus showed remarkable restraint, actually. Under those circumstances, with that level of stress, many humans would have entered the Berserker state much earlier in the scenario. And if he had, Sarah met the commander's gaze directly. Then your training facility would have been completely destroyed, along with anyone unfortunate enough to be nearby when it happened. 3 days later, Marcus Chun sat in the medical bay of the Meridian's edge, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. The physical examination had been thorough: blood work, neural scans, reflexes, cognitive assessment. Everything had come back normal, which somehow made it worse. He remembered entering the training simulation. He remembered the mounting pressure, the impossible odds, the growing certainty that he was going to fail. And then nothing. A blank space where his memory should be, followed by waking up on his knees with the taste of copper in his mouth and the distinct feeling that something inside him had fundamentally shifted. The scans show elevated activity in your amygdala and limbic system, Dr. Chen was saying, reviewing the medical data on her tablet. Consistent with what we'd expect after a berserker episode. Your serotonin levels are still recovering, which explains the mood symptoms you've been experiencing. Marcus nodded, though he wasn't really listening. He'd been through this before after Kepler Station, after the Proxima incident. Each time, the doctors had given him the same clinical explanations, the same reassurances that it was a normal response to extreme stress. None of them ever addressed the real question. How many? He asked suddenly. Dr. Chen looked up from her tablet. How many what? How many did I kill in the simulation? She was quiet for a moment, and Marcus could see her weighing whether to answer honestly. The system logged 437 enemy combatants eliminated. Marcus closed his eyes. 437. In a scenario designed to be impossible, he'd somehow managed to kill over 400 targets in less than 20 minutes. And he couldn't remember any of it. Marcus, Dr. Chen said gently, it was just a holographic simulation. No one was actually hurt. That's not the point. His voice carried a flatness that seemed to surprise both of them. The point is that I went dark again. I lost time again. And apparently, I was very, very good at what I did during that lost time. He stood abruptly, pacing to the small viewport that dominated one wall of the medical bay. Outside, the stars wheeled slowly as the ship maintained its course toward the outer system training grounds. Do you know what the worst part is? He continued, not turning around. It's not the killing. I'm a soldier. Killing is part of the job description. It's not even the fact that I can't remember doing it. The worst part is that while it was happening, I felt perfect. Dr. Chen set down her tablet and gave him her full attention. What do you mean? Marcus turned back to face her, and she was struck by the haunted look in his eyes. I don't remember the details, but I remember the feeling. Complete clarity. No doubt, no fear, no hesitation. Every movement exactly right. Every decision perfectly calculated. It was like suddenly being able to see the entire universe with perfect clarity. That's a common description of the berserker state, she said carefully. The removal of normal cognitive limitations can create a sense of enhanced perception and capability. Enhanced. Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. That's one way to put it. Another way would be to say that I temporarily became something that wasn't quite human anymore. Dr. Chen leaned forward in her chair. Marcus, you're still human. What you experienced was an extreme manifestation of human capability, not a transformation into something else. Am I? He met her gaze directly. Because I've been thinking about it for 3 days, and I'm not sure anymore. The Marcus Chen who walked into that simulation wouldn't have been capable of what happened in there. So either I've been lying to myself about who I really am, or something else took control. Before Dr. Chen could respond, the medical bay's door chimed and Commander Zethkar entered, his forearms moving in what she recognized as a formal greeting gesture. Behind him came Subcommander Vrax and 2 other Zalithian officers she didn't recognize. Sergeant Chun, Zethkar said, his translated voice carrying formal politeness. I hope you don't mind the interruption, but there are matters we need to discuss. Marcus straightened unconsciously, falling into military posture despite the informal setting. Of course, sir. I understand that you have limited recollection of the events during your training session, the commander continued. However, I wonder if you might be willing to review the sensor data with us? There are certain aspects of your performance that we're having difficulty understanding." Dr. Chen started to object, but Marcus cut her off with a gesture. "Show me." The Zilithians activated a portable holographic projector, filling the medical bay with a three-dimensional recreation of the training simulation. Marcus watched himself enter the scenario, saw his initial careful, controlled movements as he engaged the first wave of targets. "This represents your performance during the first 15 minutes, Zethkar explained. "Competent, professional, but operating within expected human parameters." The hologram shifted, showing the moment when the scenario had escalated to impossible odds. Marcus watched his simulated self take cover behind debris, saw the stress and exhaustion beginning to show in his movements. "And this is where the transformation occurred," Zethkar continued. Marcus watched himself stand up from cover and immediately understood why the Zilithians had been disturbed. The figure in the hologram moved differently, smoother, more predatory, with an economy of motion that suggested every movement had been calculated for maximum efficiency. But it was the expression on his face that truly unsettled him. The Marcus in the simulation wore a look of absolute calm, his eyes focused, but empty of anything resembling normal human emotion. He looked like a machine built for killing, wearing a human face. "The sensor data shows some interesting anomalies," Subcommander Vrax added, manipulating the hologram to display various readouts. "Your heart rate actually decreased during peak performance, while muscle efficiency increased by approximately 40%. Brain activity shifted to areas we don't normally associate with conscious thought." Marcus watched the holographic version of himself move through the battlefield with supernatural grace, eliminating targets with brutal precision. Each kill was perfect. No wasted movement, no hesitation, no mercy. It was like watching a computer algorithm made flesh. "How long did it last?" he asked. 18 minutes and 37 seconds, Zethkar replied. "During which time you eliminated all remaining targets and achieved what our tactical computers had calculated as a zero-probability victory scenario." The hologram ended with his collapse, showing the moment when whatever had taken control of his body had simply switched off, leaving him helpless on the simulated battlefield. "The medical data suggests massive neurochemical exhaustion," Dr. Chen added, consulting her tablet. "Your body was operating at levels that should have been physiologically impossible to maintain." Marcus stared at the space where the hologram had been, trying to reconcile what he'd seen with his own fragmented memories of the event. "That wasn't me," he said quietly. "It was and it wasn't," Dr. Chen replied. "It was your body, your training, your accumulated experience and instincts. But it was operating without the normal psychological frameworks that define your conscious personality. Like a computer using human hardware," Marcus murmured. "More like a predator using human intelligence," Zethkar corrected. And there was something in his translated voice that made both humans turn a look at him. "Which brings us to the reason for our visit." The commander activated another holographic display, this one showing star charts and tactical assessments. 3 days ago, we received intelligence regarding hegemony troop movements in the Vega sector, a significant force buildup that suggests they're planning something decisive. Marcus felt a familiar chill run down his spine. The hegemony was the reason humans had allied with the Zilithians in the first place, a collectivist empire that viewed individual consciousness as a form of mental illness to be corrected through forced neural integration. Current projections suggest they're planning an assault on the Kepler station system, Zethkar continued. If they succeed in taking that position, they'll have a clear path to both human and Zilithian core worlds. "You want us to stop them," Marcus said. "It wasn't a question. We want to understand our options," the commander replied carefully. "Standard tactical analysis suggests that any force we could deploy would be insufficient to counter their projected strength. However, after witnessing your capabilities, he let the implication hang in the air. Marcus understood immediately. They wanted to weaponize what they'd seen, to use human berserkers as a force multiplier against impossible odds. How many humans would you need? Dr. Chen asked, though Marcus could hear the reluctance in her voice. Our tacticians estimate that a company of personnel with similar capabilities could shift the tactical balance significantly, Subcommander Vrax replied, particularly if they could be deployed in a coordinated assault. Marcus felt something cold settling in his stomach. You want to trigger berserker states deliberately, in an entire company. The alternative is the potential fall of both our civilizations, Zethkar said bluntly. If the hegemony takes Kepler Station, they'll have the strategic position they need to launch coordinated attacks on our home systems. The casualty projections are significant. Dr. Chen stood abruptly. Absolutely not. The psychological trauma alone would be devastating. And that's assuming we could even control the response. You're talking about deliberately creating a company of individuals in an extreme dissociative state, then dropping them into a combat zone and hoping they distinguish between friend and foe. Could it be done? Zethkar asked, directing the question at Marcus. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. He thought about Kepler Station, about the civilian population that would be slaughtered if the hegemony took control. He thought about the look on his face in the holographic recording, the perfect clarity of purpose that had allowed him to achieve the impossible. Yes, he said finally, but Dr. Chun is right about the risks. Once we go dark, we're not really human anymore. We're just weapons that happen to be shaped like people. And weapons don't always distinguish between appropriate and inappropriate targets. Could you lead such a unit? The commander pressed. Could you maintain enough conscious control to direct their actions? Marcus met the alien's compound gaze directly. I don't know. Nobody's ever tried coordinating multiple berserkers before. The neural cascade effect that Dr. Chen mentioned. When one person goes dark, it can trigger others. But we've never tested it on a large scale. The alternative, Zethkar began. I know what the alternative is, Marcus interrupted. And I know what you're asking me to do. You want me to turn myself and 46 other humans into monsters so we can save our respective civilizations. If that's what it takes. Marcus looked at Dr. Chun, seeing his own conflict reflected in her expression. She understood the stakes as well as he did, but she also understood the cost better than anyone. Give me 12 hours, he said finally. I need to talk to the others. This isn't a decision I can make alone. Zethkar nodded, though Marcus could see the urgency in his posture. 12 hours. But understand, Sergeant, that every hour we delay gives the hegemony more time to consolidate their position. As the Zolithians filed out of the medical bay, Dr. Chen moved to Marcus's side. You don't have to do this, she said quietly. Marcus continued staring out at the stars, his expression thoughtful. Actually, I think I do. The question isn't whether we should do it. The question is whether we can do it without losing ourselves completely in the process. And if you can't, Marcus was quiet for a long moment before answering. Then at least our civilizations will survive to remember what we used to be. The briefing room aboard the Meridian's Edge had been reconfigured to accommodate the largest gathering of human personnel since the integration program began. 47 men and women sat in carefully arranged rows, their faces reflecting a mixture of curiosity, concern, and professional attention. Each had been personally recruited for their exceptional capabilities and psychological stability. Each carried the weight of combat experience that had forged them into something harder than ordinary civilians. Marcus Chun stood at the front of the room, flanked by Dr. Sarah Chun and Commander Zethkar. Behind them, a holographic display showed tactical assessments, casualty projections, and intelligence reports that painted a grim picture of the approaching conflict. By now, most of you have heard rumors about what happened during my training session 3 days ago, Marcus began, his voice carrying easily through the room's acoustics. What you may not know is that it represents something we've all been carrying inside us, a capability that most humans never access, and many would prefer to pretend doesn't exist. He gestured to the holographic display, which shifted to show brain scans and physiological data. Dr. Chun has been studying this phenomenon for years, and what she's discovered has significant implications for our mission here. Sarah stepped forward, her expression serious. What Marcus experienced is called a berserker state, a neurological and psychological condition that temporarily overrides normal cognitive limitations in favor of enhanced survival responses. It's not a breakdown of mental function, but rather a different kind of mental function altogether. Murmurs rippled through the assembled personnel. Several faces showed recognition, veterans who had their own experiences with that particular darkness. Others looked skeptical, uncertain how such clinical descriptions related to their mission. The condition is triggered by extreme stress and the perception of existential threat, Sarah continued. During an episode, normal moral, ethical, and physical limitations are suspended in favor of a single directive: eliminate the threat. The individual experiences enhanced physical performance, perfect tactical awareness, and complete emotional detachment. It also, Marcus added, his voice carrying a note of warning, temporarily removes the psychological frameworks that make us recognizably human. Commander Zethkar activated another section of the holographic display, showing strategic assessments of the hegemony buildup. Our intelligence indicates that the enemy is preparing to launch a decisive assault on Kepler Station within the next 72 hours. If successful, they will have the strategic position necessary to threaten both human and Zolithian core worlds. The tactical projections were sobering. The hegemony had assembled a force 3 times larger than anything the Allied fleet could deploy, with technological advantages that made conventional engagement nearly impossible. However, the alien commander continued, preliminary analysis suggests that a small force of enhanced human personnel might be able to achieve what a larger conventional force could not. The element of surprise, combined with capabilities that exceed normal tactical parameters, could shift the balance of the engagement. Lieutenant Sarah Rodriguez, a veteran of the Proxima campaign, raised her hand. Sir, are you asking us to deliberately trigger berserker states? The